Okay, so looking at today's lesson, we are going through chapter 1 first. We'll also be working our way through chapter 2 of the Essentials of Integrated Training in the Sports Performance book. By the way, they've never, this is the original version of the textbook. They never, never updated the cover for these slides, but it's the same material. So, so our objectives when we are talking about integrated training, right? That's the big thing that we're looking at today. We want to understand what integrated training is. We want to understand the principles of integrated training, the components, the rationale, and the evidence for why, you know, we've looked at this and why it's much more effective. So what do I mean when I say integrated training, right? So here's the thing, there's two types of training out there, is sort of what Nassim's saying here. There's traditional training, which, you know, when you hear the word traditional, you think like, oh, you think putting up a Christmas tree, you think like, you know, having turkey at Thanksgiving, you think of all the traditions, you know, that you might have in your life. And so it's like, we love traditions and we might think the traditional sounds really good. It's like, oh, traditional style to approach is exactly what we're going for. Traditional training is a little bit different here. What we mean by traditional training is we're talking about like all those bros in the gym who are like, you know, oh, you got to do bench press, and then you got to do this, like these are the exercises, right? And like it's what worked really well for them, right? We talk about, you talk about like I call it the bro split, right? So when you look at training splits, there's a lot of different training splits out there. You know, training splits are how you're basically laying out your volume over the course of the week, right? You have like upper lower splits where maybe it's an upper body day, lower body day. And then you have, you know, 5-day splits like this, where it's like, oh, that's also upper lower actually. See, now we're getting in like actual good training splits, but yeah, oh, here we go. There's the Jeremy Ethier did a good video on this. There's a full body split where maybe you have like full body this, full body that, upper, lower. And then here's like the bro split where it's like you have a chest day, you have a shoulder day, an arm day, a leg day, right? Like an ab day, a whole day for your abs. What? No. Like there are a lot of different training splits out there, you know? We need to know how to lay these out. That's sort of the traditional approach, was the bro split. It was like chest day, leg day, back day, stuff like that. What's up, Chris? Welcome back.
Yeah, I keep disconnecting because these mountains.
No sweat, man. I get you. Oh, that's right. That's right. You're driving to Texas today. I forgot you said last night. So there's definitely a lot going on in traditional training. It's not bad. But like we've done some more scientific research, we've learned a little bit more, and now we're finding that there's just some other principles that have been shown to be much more effective. We also know that like it's not just about lifting big heavy weights all the time. That's not the only thing that makes someone fit, right? Like, you know, it's also about mobility. It's also about stability. It's also about balance, right? It's all of these other things that kind of come together. So an integrated training approach is developing a high-level athlete who has very good balance, very good speed. Yeah, they got big muscles too. Great. They're strong. They're powerful. They can react to things, you know, and they have really good core strength and stability around their joints to make sure that nothing ever like falls out of place. So that's why integrated training is going to be better than traditional training. Traditional training, like honestly, guys, you go to group exercise every day for the rest of your life. They're not really writing those workouts for you. It's actually probably not going to be bad for you. You know, like if you're going to like Orange Theory Fitness, you know, I like that company a lot, actually. If you were to go to like their workouts every day and that was the only gym experience that you have, that's certainly better than nothing. I love it, you know. But it will never, ever be as good as actually writing a program specifically for your posture and making sure that we know where you are in your cycle, right? Where it's like, we're doing this version, then that, we're building you up, right? Building a foundation, then we're building upon that foundation. So that's the integrated training approach. It is a comprehensive, meaning that we're getting everything, right? Systematic, which means like we are going through, you know, we know that this leads to that, which leads to this, which leads to that, right? Program that develops a high-level athlete and prevents injury. It focuses on this idea of like functional strength, right? How many times do you guys see people in the gym doing this kind of lifting where they're like, they work really hard and they're like, and they just drop it every time, right? Those guys who do this kind of bicep curl, right? They do this thing. My hips popped right to that. They're doing like these type of bicep curls where it's like, and they just drop it. Like they're not doing any eccentric contraction at all, right? Well, we want functional strength. We want to be strong concentrically, yeah, absolutely. But we also want to be strong eccentrically. We want to be strong isometrically, right? We need to be able to produce force. We need to be able to reduce force. And we need to be able to dynamically stabilize our muscles, right? So that's all of our muscle actions. We're also going to make sure that functional strength is multi-planar. You know, all right, we're gonna do a little. You know, I've done this before, but so I'm not gonna go around the room here. But if I were to ask you guys to think of an exercise in your head right now, first exercise that comes to mind, I would be willing to bet that most of you guys picked a sagittal exercise. Most exercises in the gym, you look at, like, there's the bicep curl machine, there's the tricep press machine, right? There's the front raise, there's walking lunges, squats, deadlifts, calf presses, you know, all these exercises that, by the way, I love, you know, fantastic exercises. These are like my babies, you know, but they're not integrated with multi-planar, right? What about all the stuff going in the frontal plane, right? What about lateral lunges? What about, you know, side raises? What about, you know, I actually hate side bends, but, you know, what about stuff like that where you are moving laterally, right? That's a big deal. And then even more important than that, what about transverse stuff? What about twisting, right? You know, we want to make sure we're a very multi-planar athlete, because, like, yeah, you could get really good at moving front to back, but that day that you have to, like, twist, all of a sudden something pulls or tears or breaks, you're gonna be in a bad spot. And it focuses on the idea of neuromuscular efficiency, recruiting the right muscle at the right time for the right amount of force in the right plane of motion. How do you do all that? How does your brain know how to choose the right muscle at the right time for the right amount of force? Well, you get a program that's written for you specifically, right? My hamstrings are super overactive. They love to do more work than they are supposed to. My hamstrings love to tap on and do a bunch of work when my glute is supposed to be doing that work. So my hamstrings love to take over for my glutes. They love to inhibit my gluteus maximus, right? So that's not awesome. So for me, what I need is I need to coordinate my central nervous system in order to get the right muscle turned on at the right time. So if I can deactivate my hamstrings by doing a little bit of a hamstring stretch before my workout starts, right? And I can get that shut down and deactivated before I hit the gym floor, and then I can take a second to turn my glutes on by doing a couple little extra glute exercises before my barbell squats. My squats are going to be much better. I'm going to be in a much better spot because I turned the right muscle on at the right time. And my hamstrings aren't going to contract the way that they kind of like to, right? So that's an integrated program. Traditional programs, they usually focus on max strength. Traditional programs are like, yeah, we want to lift a big, heavy weight. We want to lift it as often as possible, right? That's it, right? Like, we really are just like, I don't know, how do you make it harder? Make it heavier, you know? How do we make stuff harder in an integrated program? Well, sometimes we'll make it faster, we'll make it more powerful, we'll make it more unstable. And it's like, you know, and then, yeah, of course, we will also make it heavier, you know? But we have a lot of different approaches to make things more difficult. And that's the difference between, by the way, this is another vocabulary that you guys want to learn how to talk the talk a little bit. There's a difference between hard and intense. Hard is making something more difficult. Intense is making something heavier, at least in our language, right? Intensity to a trainer means weight lifted. Hard means, like, you know, it's like, well, I can give you this little 5-pound weight, but you got to do it on one leg. And you're like, huh? You know, it becomes very hard, even though it's not very much weight. So there is a little bit of a difference between intensity. I would argue that a marathon is incredibly unintense. It's about as unintense as it gets, You might be thinking, marathons are really difficult. Yeah, absolutely. They're really hard, but the amount of effort per repetition, every step, is very low compared to a sprinter who only has to sprint for 10 seconds or so. That's very intense. That's a high percentage of maximum effort. So there's a big difference there, and we want to understand that difference. Traditional strength programs really just focus on high intensity lifting all the time, maximal strength gains. They also oftentimes isolate their muscle groups. Again, they love the bro split in a traditional program: chest day, leg day, back day. Problem with that is they end up in junk volume. You know, let's say I want to get 20 sets for my. Let's say I want to get somewhere between like 18 and 20 sets for my chest per week, because that's going to be optimal for muscle growth and strength, right? So 18 to 20 sets there. So I could do, you know, let's say I do 4 sets of a bench press, followed by an incline chest press, followed by a cable fly, followed by the pec deck, followed by a bench dips or something, right? So now I've got my 5 chest. I know that one's kind of tricep-y, but I got my 5 chest exercises, 4 sets each, right? 5, 10, 15, 20. That was 25 sets. Whoops. 3 sets each. Actually, you know what? I only need 4 exercises. So I got my 4 exercises. Wait. No, I had it right. No, yeah. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20. That's what it is. Dumb brain. So yeah, 4 sets each exercise. That's going to be 20 sets total. It's not bad. But the problem is 4, 8, when I get to about here, maybe here, right? Maybe if we got plenty of endurance, I'm really starting to run into some junk volume problems. You know, I'm really starting to run into where it's like, yeah, I'm doing my sets and I'm pushing as hard as I'm capable of, but I'm probably not really challenging my muscles as hard as I could. Now, an integrated program might look at that and say, yeah, there's a lot of junk volume where you're doing the work, but because you're not able to work your muscles very hard because they're so exhausted, it's very sloppy. So you're getting into bad habits and it's just not great for growth, right? So instead, what would happen if we did 3 chest exercises on Monday and 2 more chest exercises on Thursday? Well, if we did something like that, that's going to be a much more effective program. So now I've got a little bit of a hypertrophy day and a little bit of a max strength day, right? Where like when I'm lifting really heavy, I'm really only going to do 2 exercises. And when I'm lifting a little bit lighter, I can do 3, you know? So like this would maybe be like the cable fly, incline chest press, and let's say, what was the other one I had picked? Brain. Oh, pec deck. Jeez. So I got those 3, right? And then on day 2 here, I would do like very heavy body weight dips, or maybe even more body weight, like, you know, put a backpack on. And then I could pair that with like a really heavy bench press, right? Big bench press, big dips, right? Very, very much a max strength situation there. So now I've got a hypertrophy day and a max strength day. I'm still getting 20 sets for that body part over the course of the week. But now I've laid out my volume and I've, you know, paired things up in such a way that I don't have to worry about junk volume. So that is sort of the difference between traditional and other ones. The other big thing about traditional programs, they tend to be very sagittal. You know, it tends to be a lot of sagittal stuff. And they tend to be very much just focusing on concentric actions rather than, you know, integrated actions. So problem here, it's not multiplanar. You know, yeah, you're really good at moving front to back, but what happens when you have to move side to side? You know, the other problem, it doesn't use the entire muscle action spectrum. Maybe you can accelerate something, but you can't decelerate it, right? You can't catch it, you know? I got this guy that I play Ultimate with. He's so fast. This guy is super, super speedy, but his hand-eye, so like a great sprinter, but his hand-eye coordination is terrible. I love him to death. He's a good friend, but like constantly, he's like, right here, and you'll hit him. I will throw the perfect pass, and it will just go thunk and bounce right out of his hand. And I'm like, what's that, David?
Oh, I'm the same way. I'm the exact same, or I was the exact same way before I had to get my hand-eye coordination up.
I was
So
gonna
like,
say, I was like, you're a boxer, man.
yeah, I used to be like that. Yeah, and so I
Yeah.
had to like when we would play football and stuff, I'd be super fast. Like I'd be the first guy. I'd be all the way in the end zone within like 10
Yeah.
seconds. I'd be fast, but they throw it to me, and like I'd be waiting on the ball, and because I was waiting so long, I'd get distracted. And as soon as the ball's about to come to me, it just slipped right out of my hands. Crazy.
Did you guys ever watch this movie? Um, uh, shoot, what's this movie called? It was a football movie with a wide receiver, and like, there's this like, they're like, there's this like game-winning play, and this guy's trying to throw. It's like, don't throw it to stone hands, because he just can't catch, and then he actually does in that one. But like, the coach is like, no. Yeah, that is, that's some of the that's not directly to what we're talking about here, but in a lot of traditional programs, they focus on being good at one thing. I would rather have someone who's a little good at multiple things than someone who is exceptionally good at one thing, unless, athletically, specifically, if they're like a sprinter or something. It's like, okay, great. Like, I want you good at that one thing. Michael Phelps, I want him good at swimming. That's the end of that story, Sure. So we definitely needed to have a paradigm shift. This is where NASA created, the OPT model and a more integrated approach to training. So stuff that we are going to talk about in this class. Now you'll notice there's going to be some vocabulary words here in the PowerPoint that I am not putting in your notes today, and it's because they're going to be in the lesson. So the rest of this PowerPoint is really like, here's what you're going to learn over the next couple of days. So part of that is going to be a stretch shortening cycle. We're going to talk about how your muscles respond when you actively stretch them. When you stretch your muscles rapidly, they naturally want to contract back in the opposite direction. So you experience an active stretch, which causes an active contraction afterwards, because your muscle kind of panics. Your muscle's like, whoa, that is way too much stretching, way too fast. We are going to rip in half. So what it does is it contracts in response as sort of a protective mechanism. But if you're like, haha, that's exactly what I wanted you to do, and then you jump higher, there we go. We utilize the stretch shortening cycle to our advantage. So it's an active eccentric lengthening that causes your muscle and your nervous system to panic, and then followed by an active concentric shortening, which causes you to jump higher or be more explosive. So we love that, right? We love using stretch shortening cycles. So we are going to utilize an integrated continuum when we are looking at program design, right? We are going to do high levels of all components: stabilization, strength, and power. We're going to target muscle synergies and teach them how to work together. And we are going to focus on functional movement patterns, concentrically, eccentrically, and isometrically in multiple planes of motions in order to facilitate an overall greater training response. This is basically our fancy way of saying nobody does it better than NASM trainers. I would argue ACSM is really good as well. They have a really good approach to this as well. But we've all known that guy in the gym who goes all the time and, kind of figured out his own way in the world, honestly, that's how Golds got started. Most like gyms started by just like having a lot of bodybuilders who were pretty good at stuff, and they were like, this is what works for me, and everybody else was like, oh wow, well, what can I do, right? And they're like, well, this worked for me, it should work for you. And it's like, they're not taking into account like the physiologic differences that every individual is going to experience. Everybody's a little bit different, so we need to be able to take that into account. So training in all planes of motion, right? We've got the frontal plane of motion here, we got the sagittal plane of motion here, and we got the transverse plane here. We want to be able to be good at all those. We are going to review those in biomechanics here in just a moment. We also want to make sure that we are always training our clients with optimum posture. Without optimum posture, poor posture leads to compensations, right? You see people doing like a shoulder press and they hike their shoulders up like this in order to help. That's not helping, right? their body thinks it might, because they use those muscles all the time. We talked a little bit, Hector's trap muscles, right? They like to compensate for, the rest of his upper back muscles. So we got to get those turned off beforehand. So training in optimal alignment rather than doing maybe an excessive lean or, a low back rounding or, knees caving in, right? How do we make sure that we have that optimum posture? Well, we are focusing on what we call length tension relationships, right? Where a muscle is resting at an ideal length. The length tension relationship, you guys might remember, it's where we have the greatest overlap of those proteins in our muscle cells, right? The actin and the myosin. When we have a lot of overlap there, we get a really strong contraction. If a muscle's overactive, there's too much overlap. It doesn't have anywhere to slide, so it can't make a very strong contraction. When a muscle's underactive, it's being pulled apart. It barely has like a grip. It's like, ugh. And then, we have a really weak contraction there. So a length tension relationship is where we are getting a muscle to rest at its ideal length rather than another length, right? What that often leads to, and this is sort of like, it doesn't actually happen in order like this, but it's always a really good way to visualize it. Let's say you've got an overactive muscle on one side of a joint and an underactive muscle on the other side of the joint, right? Let's say you've got really tight hamstrings let's say we got really tight hip flexors, and that causes us to have really weak glutes, right? So now my hip flexors are overactive because they like to pull this way. And my glutes, which pull the other way, are underactive. That's going to lead to what we call altered reciprocal inhibition, okay? You might remember the term reciprocal inhibition, right? That's a physiologic principle. Whenever we contract one muscle, the antagonist relaxes so that the movement can occur. If I contract my bicep and my tricep pulls at the same time, my arm's just going to go, and it's not going to go anywhere, right? But if I contract my bicep and my tricep relaxes, it reciprocated the movement, it released it, right? It was like, oh, okay, yeah, you do your job, I'll do mine in a moment. Like that's reciprocal inhibition. Altered reciprocal inhibition is the first one, where I squeeze them both at the same time and it doesn't happen. Let's say you're just passively contracting that hip flexor 24 hours a day, 365 days a year for 5 pounds of force. Doesn't sound like that big a deal, right? It's like, yeah, it's got like a 5 pounds worth of contracting that it's always trying to do, right? Well, that tight muscle means when you go to do like hip extension, like a squatting movement, you need to be able to get it to fire for an extra 5 pounds of force, which it may not be capable of because it is literally being shut down by contracting in the opposite direction. So it's altered reciprocal inhibition. The hip flexor was supposed to reciprocate the glute by saying, oh yeah, no, you do your thing, I'll do mine in a moment. But it doesn't. It says, nope, I'm just going to keep contracting and screw whatever you need to get done. I don't care. That's altered reciprocal. That's funged up reciprocal inhibition, not awesome. And that can lead to synergistic dominance. Synergistic dominance is where a synergist then takes over. Like, your glutes didn't fire, and then the hamstrings are like, oh, well, we can help, and then all of a sudden they're doing more work than they're supposed to, right? And they're inhibiting the glutes. So that ends up leading to altered movement patterns, and that ends up leading to an injury because the hamstrings were never intended to do all that work. So, yeah, we can see an example of that here, actually. So when it comes to writing an integrated flexibility program, right, we want to address the poor flexibility by, mobilizing those muscle imbalances. When it comes to cardiorespiratory training, we want to make sure that, yeah, we're improving performance and reducing our risk of injury and increasing our speed, right? That's a big part of cardio. We are trying to, develop all things. Some people are really good sprinters. Some people are really good long distance athletes. Everybody should be good at cardio in some capacity. So we need to train that cardiorespiratory training program, which a lot of traditional programs are like, just do your cardio whenever. And they kind of push it off to the side. They kind of forget about it. Core training, right? We want to make sure that we have a strong core to keep our discs from sliding around so we don't get injured. We want to have good balance training so we make sure that we don't move through the wrong ranges of motion. We're going to use proprioceptively enriched environments. We're going to use unstable, wobbly environments. That's what that means, right? And And that's going to be good because, again, if you can do a single leg shoulder press, you can certainly do a 2 legs planted on the ground shoulder press. And we're going to train for plyometrics. We're going to use those stretch shortening cycles as often as possible to make our client more explosive and improve their speed. Speaking of speed, we're going to work on SAQ training, speed, agility, and quickness training, right? We're going to learn how to travel in one direction really fast. We're also going to learn how to change directions really quickly. And we're going to learn how to adjust our body. We're going to work on that hand-eye coordination. And then when it comes to our actual strength training, we get into the resistance stuff. Yeah, we are going to train it in a lot of different ways. We're going to focus on, injury prevention with stabilization. We're going to focus on endurance with the strength endurance phase. We're going to focus on muscle building with hypertrophy, maximum strength in maximum strength, and we're going to focus on power. So most important things to remember when it comes to an integrated program is that we are making sure it is always safe, effective, it is systematic and progressive. So it builds on a foundation, and it does focus on the nervous system in addition to the muscular system. That is everything we are going to learn over the next 10 days. Any questions on that before we dive into a little bit of kinesiology? Nope.
No questions.
Alrighty. Where is it? There it is. So, human movement science, right? Let's go here. All right. So, we are going to be looking at biomechanics today. You guys might remember that term from the beginning of this module when we were talking about it in PFT 101, right? So this is the study of, we say, interrelated systems, the muscular, articular, and neural. Big fancy way of saying, look, we need to understand how our muscles move, how our bones move, and how our brain controls all of it. Right? So our muscular system, we're going to see some anatomy there. Our skeletal system, we're going to see some joints and how they are all kind of interconnected. And our nervous system, we need to understand what we call our motor behavior. So biomechanics is the study, the science of how the body interacts with internal and external forces. It's what's going on. It's how your body creates internal tension to move around the world, which has all these external tensions and external forces and stuff, right? That is really what we are seeing there, right? So in order to understand that, we need to understand that we primarily move through these 3 planes of motion. And for the record, it should be stated, and we see it right here, no movement is strictly in one plane of motion. Like even bicep curls, there's a little bit of rotation that happens in your elbow joint, like it's not perfectly a sagittal movement every time. There's a little bit of like pronation and supination that occurs. So don't think that like you're only ever moving like sagittally, frontally, or transversely, but for the most part, for simplifying it, we don't need to be pedantic. We don't need to be like, well, technically, it's like, it's like when you were a kid and your parents were like, sitting, I don't know if your parents do that. I would get in timeout all the time. They would be like, sit there and don't move. And my little pedantic butt, I would be like, well, the earth is moving, so I can't not move. My parents would be like, so yeah, so we don't need to be like, we're going to simplify this down and say, for the most part, every movement is going to move primarily through one plane of motion. Even though, yes, at a microscopic level, surely there's some other stuff happening. So our 3 planes of motion are, I haven't thought about that in a while. Our 3 planes of motion are the sagittal plane, the frontal plane, and the transverse plane. So there are specific actions that can only occur in those motion, in those planes, right? So the sagittal plane is this imaginary plane that divides our body into left and right halves. So what happens is we move along that sagittal plane, right? Actually, that's kind of perfect right there. I like that one, and I like this one. So you can kind of see here, right? So this person is being divided into a left side and a right side, right? And so like they're going to move primarily along with that plane. You imagine like, you guys ever see those like magnet things you can buy to clean the outsides of windows, right? Like you stick it on one side, and you stick it on the other, and then like you can kind of wash your windows with it. That, you know, you have to kind of move directly with whatever direction that glass is going. That's what's happening here. So I would be moving everything like this. So our sagittal movements that we have are going to be flexion and extension. If it's happening in my elbow, we call this elbow flexion. We call this elbow extension. We call this hip flexion. We call this hip extension. We call this knee extension. We call this knee flexion, right? There is only flexion and extension in the sagittal plane. There is one special one here, which really I should be adding this. I'm going to put this down here actually. Modify our notes a little bit. We're also going to see what's called plantar flexion, and we are going to see dorsiflexion. Those are the special ones. Plantar flexion and dorsiflexion are the special ankle ones. And really they're an example of flexion and extension. It's just because the foot is the only part of the body that comes out at a right angle, like away from us. Like your nose does that too, but like, you know, it doesn't move. So because like this comes out at a right angle here, it gets a special name. We have plantar flexion, which is pointing your toe away, and we have dorsiflexion, which is pulling your toe back towards you. So plantar flexion would be like me going up onto my toes. Dorsiflexion would be if I rocked back onto my heels. I've got flexion and extension. There's a lot of different versions. All of those are the sagittal movements. I'm moving around a little bit. I'm going to lose this sweatshirt. All right, so next movements that we have also got the frontal plane, right? Frontal plane is going to divide you into front and back sections, right? So this one is dividing us down the side like this. We've got a back half and a front half. So everything that moves along that plane this way is like side to side actions, right? Like, you know, it cuts him down right in the middle there. So if he does stuff like this, that's a frontal plane movement, or this, right? Or this. All of this kind of action is frontal plane. So even like, it doesn't look like it, but you think about like doing a shoulder press, right? My shoulder is going this way in the frontal plane. If I was doing pull-ups, right, that's a very frontal plane movement versus a chin up, right? So chin up is going this way. That's very sagittal. A pull-up is going this way. That's very frontal. So there's a little bit of a difference between those two movements there. What plane of motion? So which one do we want to be good at? Again, integrated training program. We want to be good at all of them, right? So do I like chin-ups better than I like pull-ups? No. Do I like pull-ups better than I like chin-ups? No. I like them both. They're both part of an integrated training program. Now, am I better at one of them than I am at the other? For some reason, I'm better at pull-ups. It doesn't explain that one. Chin-ups are traditionally the easier one, probably because I just don't have the biggest arms in the world. So those motions, we have abduction versus adduction, right? So abduction, think of it this way. My arms are being abducted by aliens, right? And then I am adding them back to my body. So a pull-up is shoulder adduction. A shoulder press is shoulder abduction because it's moving away from the midline or closer to the midline. Abducting is moving away. Adducting is moving closer to my midline there. There is also lateral flexion, which is part of the frontal plane as well, and that's all this stuff. Now, you might be wondering why we don't have an opposite version of that. It's like lateral flexion. Well, we have left-right lateral flexion, and we have right-left lateral flexion. They're both flexion, because like, you know, the angle is decreasing and stuff. Your head, same thing. But that's all those are the frontal plane movements. Technically in the frontal plane as well, if we are talking about the ankle, we have also got eversion and inversion. So I'm going to use my palm as an example because it's a little bit easier to see. But we see this kind of thing where it comes this way versus where it goes this way, right? Like it's still facing forward, but it kind of goes side to side. Your foot can do that as well, right? If I bring my foot up, right, I can bring the bottom of my foot towards the midline, and I can bring the bottom of my foot away from my midline. That is inversion going towards the midline versus eversion going away from the midline. We lost Edwin this time. So ankle inversion, ankle inversion going in, ankle eversion going out, okay? So that is a frontal plane movement as well. And then we have got the transverse plane, which is going to divide our body into upper and lower divisions, right? So we've got half the body here and half the body here. It cuts us in top to bottom there, right? So the transverse plane is this one, right? Dividing us into upper lower. So anytime you spin, basically, right? If I was being cut like this, right? And I can move, you know, the bottom of my body this way, and I can move the top of my body this way, right? Now I've got transverse action there, right? I feel like a G.I. Joe. Well, I feel like the little G.I. Joes. Your head going like this, right? Your arm doing this, right? Even if I get my arm up like this, right? I have now effectively abducted my shoulder, but I can also do transverse rotation. Now you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, like it's supposed to cut us into upper or lower. If you're here and this is cutting me into left and right, does that make this sagittal? No, it does not, because I don't care what position I'm in currently. I care what position the joint would be in if I were standing in the anatomic position, which is this. And if I were rotating, it would be happening this way, right? So rotational movements, right? Spinal rotation, that's transverse. Neck rotation, that's transverse. So we have either internal rotation or we have external rotation. Internal rotation is going toward, is rotating inward. External rotation is rotating outward. So internal, external, right? Internal, external, internal, external. One more. You've also got ankle external rotation and ankle internal rotation. Those are going to happen as well. At the foot and ankle complex, we are going to see just from the ankle down a very slight tibial rotation there and a very slight tibial rotation there. And I always have to hold my knee there because I'll do extra. One more that is transverse as well. What if I take my arms up like this and I go this way or this way, right? So this is, I'm adding it back to my midline or I'm taking away from my midline. It's very much transverse because transverse is sliding this way, right? So chest presses, rows, chest flies, reverse flies, things like that. We call that horizontal adduction or horizontal abduction. I'm either moving toward my midline or away from my midline, but this time it's horizontal instead of vertical, which normally abduction, adduction, horizontal adduction, horizontal abduction. So those are some of the terms that we're going to use when we are understanding these planes of motion. So now you got to write a program that uses all of them. Now, does that mean you have to think about it every freaking time? Not really, you know, like, as long as you're picking a variety of exercises, guys, you're going to be in a good spot. But if you start to look at your programs and you're like, man, that's a lot of sagittal stuff, maybe get some freaking frontal stuff in there. Or like if you have an athlete who's like, you know, they sprained their ankle, right? The most common sports related injury. This is the class where we're going to say that 50, 60 times. We go look at the lateral ankle sprain. This is number one injury, right? This happened because the ligament that attaches the fibula to the talus there basically gets torn, right? So this right here, which is called your ATL ligament. So that's you, that gets torn. Why the heck did that happen? Well, who knows? What if they spend all day? One of the reasons that could have happened is because maybe they spent all freaking day, you know, in ankle eversion. Sorry. I thought that was like a work thing, and then I realized it was my roommates and our neighbors have put up their Hanukkah stuff, which means that there's going to be a party tonight, and it's going to go till like 4 in the morning, and it's going to be really loud. Sorry. So, you know, maybe they spend all day like this. Remember we talked about how bad pronation distortion is, right? If they spend all day collapsing their foot in like this, right? Well, now this ligament right here is in a shortened position 24 hours a day. Good God, guys. It's in a shortened position 24 hours a day. So because of that, because it's in that shortened position, now it's losing its ability to be flexible. So the first time they step off a curve and they roll their ankle a little bit like this, that ligament's gonna tear, you know? I mean, this is where, look, I'm not trying to flex on anybody or anything, but like I know a lot of people who cannot stand on their ankle like this. I mean, it is hard to balance, but like this would absolutely sprain their ankle just putting their body weight on it like that. You should be able to do that. We should have proper ankle mobility. I, heaven forbid, knock on freaking wood here, have never sprained my ankle. And it's because like when I was a kid, I actually shattered my ankle. I broke, of the tarsals in my feet, I broke 22 of them. Completely liquidized it when I was a child. And so my parents were told by my doctor to always like wear, you know, basically like basketball shoes, like really high top ankle shoes. So I would have extra support for the leg forever. And I did that for a long freaking time until I got to school and realized, yeah, I have all these ankle problems. Like my ankles were really weak. Every time I'd try to like juke or cut to the side or something, I just felt like I'd like fall down. I was never all that great at basketball. You know, I was never all that great at a lot of sports. And, you know, I was good at cross country because that was just straight running forward. It was sagittal, you know, like the minute you made me do frontal plane movements or you made me do transverse movements, I'd fall apart as an athlete. Until I got to school and I started studying all this nonsense. And I was like, all right. And I started doing a lot of single leg exercises where I would do a lot of balance. And I went to like a minimalist shoe design. And now I haven't had an ankle injury since I was a child because like I have trained to do a lot of unstable stuff thanks to an ASM and you know, just advanced training techniques. So let's do that for our freaking clients, right? So now we got to look at some of our combined joint actions. We do have a couple combined ones. 2 versions of this here. You are going to see your scapular movements. Scapular movements are how your scapula moves a little bit differently, right? Your scapula is that shoulder blade, right? It is, by the way, scapula just means shovel in Latin. So it kind of looks like the head of a shovel. But yeah, you can see your scapula. It's really designed to do a couple movements here, right? It can do, that'll work. It can do retraction where it's going to move like this. It can do protraction where it comes around like that. It can do elevation. It can do depression. And it can do a little bit of rotation as well. It swings like this and it swings like that. So it also does tilt as well, but they're not mentioning that one here. So those are our scapular movements. The big ones they want you to know. They want you to know scapular retraction, scapular protraction, scapular elevation, and scapular depression. So a lot of people have that pronation distortion. A lot of people have that upper cross syndrome. where we see shoulder protraction, right? Internal rotation, and a forward head posture. We're walking around like this all day, right? That's your classic, there we go, perfect. That's your classic, situation that we're seeing here. And then this guy's also got like a posterior tilt, which is also not great, but for other reasons. So we need to focus more with somebody like that. We need to work on their retraction. We need to work on their scapular depression because they do too much of these things. Now, in the foot and ankle, you might have noticed I kept adding ankle stuff. There are some interesting, special ankle movements. Your ankle is very unique because of the angle that it's set at. So we have pronation and supination. So this is something you guys want to get memorized in this class. Pronation is a combo of multiple things. So remember, what are our ankle movements? Our ankles can dorsiflex and plantar flex. They can evert and invert, and they can internally rotate, and they can externally rotate. Those are the 3 planes of motion. Dorsiflexion, plantar flexion, eversion, inversion, internal/external rotation, right? Sagittal, frontal, transverse. Cool. Now, put them all together. Let's say somebody does a little bit of eversion, and they do a little bit of dorsiflexion, and they do a little bit of external rotation. When we put all of those things together, we call that pronation. Pronation is a combination of eversion, dorsiflexion, and external rotation. Now, what happens with that is it screws up your foundation. It's like having a building, it's like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? This was built on a bad foundation. So it tilted, right? And so like now, because of that bad foundation, it's slowly leaning over. Will it fall? I gotta watch that someday. I'm gonna open this up and leave this tab down here for me. Hush. I'm gonna watch that later. So right there's ankle pronation. Their foundation sucks, right? Look at that. That's crazy, right? So that is a combination of things, right? We are seeing the flat feet thing happen, right? The feet turn out a little bit and the ankles fall inward, right? Too much eversion. They're rotating the foot away like this. Too much external rotation. They're swinging it away like that, right? And too much dorsiflexion. They're kind of like keeping all their weight way too much in their heels. So all of that is happening simultaneously, and that is going to then travel up to the knees when they're like squatting or standing, right? They're going to then do this. They're going to be knock-kneed, right? Because this is messed up. So now this is going to rotate, and then that's going to mess up the hip, right? So that's why pronation is so bad for us. And this is what leads to that ankle sprain I talked about earlier. You want to get a lateral ankle sprain? It's easy to do. Get way too good at pronation. We'll see pronated runners. We see it all the time.
When I was running half marathons, watching some people with their pronation, it just looked painful. Like I could feel the pain because like they had the wrong shoes and like totally like rotating. It was the worst thing I ever to watch.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like, what sucks about it is like people will buy pronating fixing shoes. They'll like, oh, if you're a pronator, you need to buy this, and it's supposed to like help you, and it never gets better because like they're not training their muscles. They're just trying to find a thing that'll strap them in a certain way. And so those muscles never get developed properly. I have like a love-hate relationship with the modern running shoe industry. Because I think like you should be training your body to do something. Don't put it on autopilot, you know? But let's see here. So see that right there? Do you see how like, I'm gonna play this in slow motion a little bit. Setting. Playback speed. Okay. So see that right there? right? He's externally rotating. Not so bad on this side, but this side's not good at all. Big external rotation, right? Big. He lands and then his foot rolls. Look at that. It's everting, right? The bottom of his foot everted out this way. So he's doing a major pronated run. You can see the angle of his tibia comes off like this instead of going straight up. Not awesome, right? For the record, it's not great to look at. This is why, I told you guys about that assessment business. Get a high-speed camera that can slow things down like this. Show this to people, videotape them and be like, this is what your ankle's doing. You need to do more of, and then write them a program. That is excessive pronation. Now there's also excessive supination. It's not quite as common, but you'll see like the excessive supination sometimes as well. This we don't see as commonly, but this is the one where we have sort of the high arch, right? So pronation, tibia comes this way. Supination, tibia comes this way, right? This is somebody who is, their foot's barely touching the ground, right? They have a little bit of contact here and a little bit of contact here. There's way too high of an arch happening here. So excessive supination is not ideal either when it comes to running. Oh, wow, look at that. You can see somebody who, look at their shoes here, right? They're wearing down the outsides. That's crazy because they're basically just grinding like that all day. This is the type of person who doesn't get a lateral ankle sprain. This is the person who gets a medial ankle sprain. Same problem, just this isn't quite as common. We don't see people fall into this trap as often. Just because the movements associated with supination are not as common in everyday movement, but it is the exact opposite. Instead of excessive eversion, it's excessive inversion. Instead of dorsiflexion, it's plantar flexion. And instead of external rotation, it's internal rotation. That is what we're going to see when we see knee varus. We see that person who's got the bow-legged posture. This kind of thing here, where it's kind of bowing away. That is knee varus, right? We will also, for the the bow-legged thing. Sometimes that can happen, by the way. You can get what's called rickets. That's why they're drawing this one in like a kid version here. See, this kid has the bow-legged thing. That sometimes happens if they don't get enough calcium or vitamin D when they're developing, and your bones can grow that way. That's what's known as rickets. Weird, fun disease fact for the day. Man, my coffee is attacking me this morning. Drink water. So those are your special ankle movements. Any questions on pronation or supination, guys?
You say balance work is the best stuff for that, like one leg balance work?
Yeah, honestly, learning how to stand on one leg, keep your weight on those 3 points of contact, right? So single leg lift and chops, right? Single leg bicep curls, single leg shoulder presses, single leg cable press, single leg row. Anytime you get your client on one foot, they're going to strengthen the muscles of their foot. They're going to strengthen the proprioception in their ankle, and it will give your nervous system and muscular system the information that it needs to go, oh, I don't move the way I'm supposed to. Okay. All right. We'll make some adjustments. It gives your brain the awareness that it needs. So next thing we got to talk about our muscle action spectrum, right? So again, we've got 3 types of movements here. We've got concentric movements, we've got eccentric movements, and we've got isometric movements. So we're going to go ahead and start with eccentric movements. So eccentric contractions are contractions that occur when the muscle is lengthening. There's a lot of different things that you can think of when you think of eccentric contractions. You can think of it as deceleration, right? Let's say somebody drops something to me and I have to catch it like this, and I'm going to receive it, as I'm catching it, right? I'm decelerating. Like that thing's got a lot of force as it's falling. It's picking up momentum. So I'm going to hit it and then slow it down. I'm going to decelerate it. that isn't, and you know, we look at what my muscles are doing, right? My muscles are lengthening, right? As I'm coming down. I'm being my chest muscles, which would have been in charge of pushing forward. In this case, they are pulling apart. They're lengthening, right? So that's a deceleration. You can also think of it as like the tension that your muscle is generating is less than the external force. If I've got a 100-pound barbell in my arm right here, and I only generate 90 pounds of force, the barbell is going to win the battle and lengthen out my muscles as it comes down, right? So that's an eccentric contraction, okay? So deceleration or force reduction. Now, this is where a stretch shortening cycle starts. That's why we started with this one. So we think about like a stretch shortening cycle, right? Let's say I want to jump really high. Well, I can't, like, imagine if I was already maximum length like I am right now and I tried to jump as high as I can. Right? It didn't exactly go anywhere, right? Like I didn't have any I didn't have any room to contract, right? Like, you know, it's like Superman trying to learn how to fly for the first time, you know, nothing happened. So what I had to do, right? What I have to do is I have to lengthen my muscles first. When I sit into a squat like this, my glutes are being lengthened, they're being pulled apart because now they've got room to contract, right? Imagine if you were trying to jump over a gap, right? And you're like, whew, that's a big gap, right? What are you gonna do? You're gonna get a run up so you can pick up some momentum before jumping. You need to lengthen before you can shorten. So that's a stretch shortening cycle. This is the stretch part of the stretch shortening cycle. Now, in the middle, where we're transitioning, we've got the isometric contraction. So isometric contractions are where the muscle is contracting for the same amount of force. If an eccentric contraction is the muscle contracting for less force than the resistance, then isometric contractions are an equal force in the resistance, right? So these are muscle contractions that are where the muscle is remaining the same length. These are stabilizing actions, right? So stabilizing actions are like where our muscles are pushing for the same, right? So if that thing was coming down and I was decelerating it, and eventually I was decelerating it and I matched the level of force, now it's going to stop and I'm just going to be able to hold it there, right? So if I was doing shoulder raises, the eccentric portion would be lowering it back down to the ground. The concentric portion would be raising it up. And then if I just held it right here like this, that's isometric. Now, take a look right here, guys. This is a term that some of you might not have seen just yet. There is a special version of isometric that happens when it happens at light speed. Like when it's happening super, super, super fast, we don't call it isometric, even though it is an isometric. We call it amortization. So amortization is a special term that we apply to explosive movements. It is the transitional period of stabilization that occurs between the lengthening and the shortening, between the eccentric and concentric. So as I'm about to do like a big jump, right? Like this. As I come down and then transition to go up, that little bit of micro transition that happens in between, that's our amortization. Anybody in here, Amir's not in here right now, but I know that he's got like his apartment. Anybody in here who is a homeowner of some type, you might be familiar with the term amortization. If I look this up, you'll see it's like a lot of like numbers here and charts that look like this. Amortization is the amount of time that it takes before your home loan that you buy is actually making you money. It's the transitionary period, right? When you open a business, you're going to go massively into debt, right? But then you're going to slowly pay that debt off and you're going to start to turn a profit. Most businesses lose money in their first 3 to 5 years, and then they start turning a profit after that. So that transitionary period is amortization. But what if you could lose a bunch of money for 6 months and then all of a sudden you start turning a profit? Whoo, there we go. Fast amortization. That's also the key to athletics, right? The faster you can transition, the more explosive you're going to be, right? Watch every every Sunday, watch the NFL, right? You see players where they're at the line and they're doing this kind of thing. They're juking side to side and then they're sprinting, right? If I'm trying to lose, or playing basketball, right? You do a crossover over here and then you come over this way, right? That was my best crossover. It was terrible. If you do that, whoever can do that the fastest, that is going to be the more athletic person. So if you can transition from here to here, we want amortization to be as short as possible. The faster you can amortize, the more explosive and athletic you are going to be. You're gonna break some ankles in a good way. And then we've got our concentric contractions. This is the positive, right? This is the one that we tend to think of when we think of contractions. But these are muscle actions that occur when the muscle is shortening, right? So let's say I'm applying force to something and throwing it away. I'm accelerating it. I'm producing force, right? The tension that my muscles are generating is greater than the resistive force. So if I've got 10 pounds in my hands and I generate 11 pounds of force, right? I'm going to overcome it. That's the final part of the stretch shortening cycle. It's the shortening or the jumping part of the stretch shortening cycle. So that is absolutely key to understanding athletics. And that is why, you know, I get so annoyed when I see people do plyometrics sometimes because like they just do them where they don't focus on shortening that transitionary period. They focus only on like the big jumping part. And for the record, that's great when you're starting out. If you're like a beginner, you should focus on learning how to just do the jump and how to stabilize your landings, right? That's why NASM has reactive stabilization exercises is what they're called. Joseph, Chris, and Edwin, what that means is like in the beginning stages, when I'm learning how to jump, it's gonna look like this. And I'm gonna have this like big long pause. And then eventually I'm gonna start training for transitioning. I'm gonna start training for amortization, where I'm getting a little bit of rhythm. And then eventually I'm gonna get into like maximum power training, where I'm really training for force production and amortization. So that might be something like this. Right, where I do a big jump and then a big, big, big jump afterwards, right? Or I might jump down from a box and then do my jump. So that's the difference between stabilization, strength, and power. That'll happen better later. You'll get a much better explanation in a couple days. So now if we're talking about all this posture stuff, you know, I know we talked this into the ground in PFT 101, but again, the reason we need to make sure that we understand our muscle actions, we need to understand what planes of motion things move through, and the reason we need to understand how to contract our muscles the way we want is because ideally our muscles need to have the right length tension relationship. That's the resting length of a muscle and the amount of tension they can generate at that length. So when we look at this, right? You can see here in the middle, there's a good amount of overlap of actin, the thin protein, and myosin, the thick protein overlap, right? There's room to contract and there's already a good amount of overlap. There's space and there's overlap. Over here, this is an overly lengthened muscle. This muscle can't generate very much force. It's over lengthened. There's plenty of room to move, which is good, but there's no overlap. So we get a weak contraction. Over here, there's too much overlap and there's no room to move. So that's an overactive muscle. So we got force reduction here and force reduction here. That sucks, right? This muscle's weak in both of these versions, but over here, it's really strong, right? So that's where we need to look. It's like, oh man, you've got really bad rounded shoulders. Your pecs are over shortened and your upper back is over lengthened. we need to shorten your upper back and we need to lengthen your chest. If we can do that, we can get you back into good posture and you will be much stronger. So it's the optimal amount of overlap of those proteins. Now, obviously, we also have force velocity curves. A force velocity curve is something you need to remember when it comes to muscles. Force and velocity are opposites of each other, guys. Force is the amount of weight that you're lifting. Velocity is the speed at which you are lifting it. You can either have something that is high force or you can have something that is high velocity. You can't exactly have a lot of both. But you can have a little bit in the middle, which gives you a little bit of both, which actually gives you the most power. But basically, if your force is high, your velocity is low. If your velocity is high, your force is low, okay? And that's what we call the sort of force velocity curve there. So, you know, we want to make sure that, like, you know, we are sort of training a little bit of both so that we are increasing our muscles. This is why, for those of you who have been through program design, one of the best ways to actually improve your power in something is to do a super heavy movement first and then do a super light movement second that's explosive. So I do like a really heavy bench press, right? I get like maybe 5 repetitions and I'm like, nope, no more than that. And I rack it, right? I worked on the force production of my chest. Then I get that super big medicine ball and I bend over and I go wham, 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 just like this. I'm slamming into the ground, it's bouncing back, right? Now I'm working on my chest velocity afterwards. So now I'm getting the best of both worlds, right? Get a little bit of force production and a little bit of velocity production. Both those things are going to come together to create the most powerful chest movements that I can, right? Or a medicine ball chest pass, or I could even use like resistance bands and literally do my super heavy bench press on the bench, right? And then rack it, immediately stand up, go over to the wall. Maybe I've got a resistance band tied in and just, it looks a little silly, but trust me, it's a really great way to improve your explosiveness. Another term we got to see, we do have force couples. It's Kim and Kanye. It's my favorite joke. I use it every time. A force couple is the synergistic action of multiple muscles working around a joint. So when you think of your rotator cuff, right, you've got like muscles up above, you got muscles down below, right, creating stability as you're moving through an entire range of motion. That's a force couple. Or when you think about like your glutes, hamstrings, hip flexors, quads, calves, all of those muscles working together to create like movement, that is very much a force couple. So that is sort of the general terminology around how our joints are going to move and how our muscles are going to contract. But now we do need to really quickly label and remember how our muscles are labeled out when they are doing whatever job it is that they are specifically doing, right? So when we are labeling out our muscles, whenever we are describing the main muscle that is doing a specific action, when we're describing like the main muscle that's doing a movement, right? Let's say we're describing a bicep curl. What muscle is primarily working? My bicep, right? When I do a chin up, right, my primary muscle is going to be my lats, right? So that is what we refer to as the agonist. The agonist is the prime mover for whatever motion, right? So when we think about like our hip extension movement, right? We're doing this. We're doing hip extension. We're driving our hip straight back like that, right? That's a squat. As I come out of the squat, right? That's the main muscle doing all the work. That's the gluteus maximus, okay? That is our agonist. It's the prime mover. The antagonist is exactly the opposite. My psoas, which live up here, they attach to my spine and it runs down as part of my hip, right? That's a hip flexor. It pulls this way, which is exactly the opposite of this, right? So my hip flexors are the antagonist to my gluteus maximus, right? So during hip extension, my glute should be doing most of the work and my hip flexors should relax. And then we have synergists as well, right? Synergists are helper muscles, right? My hamstrings assist with this action here, right? They help a little bit, when I do that hip extension. They don't help a lot, but they help a little bit, right? So they're a synergist. And then lastly, I've got all these muscles in my abs, all these little tiny muscles around my hips, little anconius, all these little tiny itty bitty stabilizers that we never talk about. Those are our stabilizers that keep our body in alignment as we move through these functional patterns, right? That's what we're looking for in terms of developing when we look at a stabilization routine. When we look at a strength routine, yeah, I care about the agonist, right? Different routines, different clients, different goals, but we need to make sure that we understand which muscle is responsible for which movement, so during a chin up, right? I'm doing a chin up. I'm pulling myself up just like this, right? My latissimus dorsi is the agonist for my shoulder extension. My biceps are the agonist for my elbow flexion. And then my antagonist muscles that I've got, right, are going to be like my anterior deltoid, my triceps, right? Those are antagonists. And then the main muscle that should be doing most of the work should be my lats. The muscles that are helping, yeah, my biceps are synergizing with my lats to make this happen, right? And then meanwhile, my entire core and rotator cuff are there to stabilize so I don't tear anything. Does that make sense, guys? Questions on that part?
Yeah.
I mean, so pretty much what this is like the easiest way. Well, this is how you label out what certain muscles do, right? So the movements or like what they should be doing. So extensions, you should be like, okay, for example, bicep curl. The bicep, that's the agonist.
Yes.
Antagonist, your tricep.
There we go.
Synergist, I don't know that one. I was gonna say
it's your forearm muscles. These little tiny little forearm muscles help, but they don't do much. They're like the hamstrings to your glutes.
Right.
Just like your calves are helpers to your hamstrings. They don't do a lot of work, but they do a little bit. They're synergists.
They do just enough to keep the flow going, right?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, love that. And then stabilizers are all little tiny ones. We often don't label out our stabilizers. Look at like your anconius. That's the example I said earlier. Little itty bitty tiny muscle in your elbow, that's a stabilizer. It's just this little itty bitty muscle back there. It's technically part of your triceps, but we never talk about that one. We get your pectineus, little itty bitty muscle there in the hip. It's just there to stabilize everything. It's technically a hip flexor.
Would you say that? Me and Eddie were talking about this last night, and I wanted to see if this was true because so we were talking about injuries, and we were talking about as to why somebody could blow out their quads and they could be back in tip top shape in 2 years. Mm-hmm. But if somebody blows out their shoulder, they're out for a while, and usually they're never the same again. And the reason I said was because I feel like your shoulder, it just has so many muscles and useless muscles, as we like to call them, in the sense that they don't really do much.
Yeah,
they're just there, and because there's so many tiny muscles that if they get destroyed, it's kind of hard to build them back up to what they were. That's my head logic.
No, it's a good thought, because basically your shoulder is just more complex. There's a lot of little tiny moving parts. Also, naturally, the shoulder joint is a ball and socket joint, which is great because it's very mobile, right? The more mobile something is, awesome. We have a lot of range of motion. The negative part of that is that there's a lot of connective tissue that has to make up for a lack of surface area contact. So because there's not very much surface area contact, right, we have more mobility, right? If you look at how much range of motion I can move right now, right? I have to break. All I can do is go up and down and side to side. I can't go this way, right? Because if I do, I'm breaking away from my contact, right? If I go like this, I'm losing contact with my palm, right? But then if you look at if I were connected here, right, just barely at the edge of my palm like that, where I'm barely touching, Well, now I can move up and down easily. I can still do all that sliding stuff, but now these three knuckles have the ability to move. They have more mobility. They have less stability.
Okay.
So that's a big part of the shoulder. Shoulder is like one of the worst, and hips are really bad, and knees are really bad, right? Whereas when you pull a muscle, you can usually come back with a pulled muscle because it's just very easy to repair that one thing. You repair like the connective tissue associated, that takes longer. And then the other part of that as well, David, connective tissue will always take longer to heal because it doesn't get as much blood flow.
Right. Okay.
So
Yeah.
Nutrients delivered.
So the reason why we were talking about this is I think we were just interviewing each other, and then I came to this conclusion because it sounds dumb, but like, you know, it helped me out a lot because when I used to be big into like WWE, there would be every wrestler, like it's not even a joke, like every wrestler has blown out their quads. Like Triple H, he's done it twice, and he came back and he was in the best shape of his career. But then these newer guys, Finn Balor, it happened like a few years ago. He got power bombed into the turnbuckle, and he ended up destroying his shoulder. He came back, was never the same.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, quads are also, that's also a muscular problem versus a connective tissue problem. But also your shoulders is really complex.
okay.
Complicated.
All right.
A lot of little tiny muscles in there.
Okay, I didn't want to make it seem like I was just talking, you know, out of nowhere. So.
No. I think your instincts are good for sure. All right, so last little bit here. We do got to look at some stabilizing systems that come together, right? You know, there are several stabilizer systems. There's what we call our local muscular system. You think local, you think close to home, right? Well, these are all the muscles that are closest to your spine. Right, so your local muscular system are things like your rotator cuff, right? They're there holding your rotator cuff, or in your core, right? If you're looking at your abs holding your spine, you've got your transverse abdominis. That's the layer of abs underneath your six pack, right? So you go underneath behind that. That is your transverse abdominis. You got those big deadlifter muscles, the erector spinae. Underneath that, you have your multifidi, your multifidus. Those little itty bitty stabilizer, the transversospinalis muscles, depending on who you ask. But then we have the global system that's beyond that moves you around the globe, right? This is your global movement system, right? This is responsible for actually like moving. Like if I want to move my spine, that's what my six pack is for, my rectus abdominis instead of my transverse abdominis. If I want to move my hips, right, rather than stabilizing, I'm going to use my gluteus maximus. If I want to move my shoulder joint, I'm going to use my deltoids, right? So there are these little subsystems. You guys don't have to worry too much about these. But if you look at like your muscle, that's not what I'm looking for. If you look at like these synergies that are out there, you've got like what's called your deep longitudinal subsystem, right? And basically that is the muscle along the back here and then coming down. So like your hamstrings, calves, and erector spinae all sort of work together, right? All of those, like that's like when you're deadlifting, right? You're using your deep longitudinal subsystem. You've also got your posterior oblique subsystem. This is the stuff on the back side. This is the muscles on the backside that actually cross from side to side. Your glutes and your lats actually work well together. They kind of wrap around the body, right? And then the other one wraps this way, which is why oftentimes when you have an injury, it goes to the hips and then transfers to the other side. Well, we also have the anterior oblique system, right? Again, you have a hip flexor problem here, you're probably going to have an oblique problem over here, right? So it'll go across the body. So we're basically wrapping the body in the back and in the front. So it looks something kind of like this when you lay them all out. Right? We are wrapping and creating stability like this. There's also a little bit up there in the arms, but basically the big ones we're paying attention to. We got here, the superficial, it's the posterior deep longitudinal subsystem. We've also got the lateral subsystem. Not really seeing a good example. Oh, there we go. Yeah, this one right here, right along the side. Lateral subsystems. So don't worry too much about those. They do have like these big lists here, but that's just to kind of highlight for you guys and show you how much synergy is sort of occurring here. So then we've also got all of the individual muscles. You can find that list of muscles, list of agonist muscles in your textbook, pages 37 through 62. I do recommend getting familiar with those. The biggest ones you want to memorize are the ones that are on the overhead squat table, but those are where you want to know what muscle is supposed to be the agonist versus what muscle is supposed to be a synergist or, you know, maybe antagonist. So all of that kind of comes together to lead finally to how we coach all of this to happen. So when we're coaching our clients, we are, you know, developing their what we call motor behavior. Okay, your motor behavior is your body's response to this stimuli, right? It's made up of a couple different things. Motor control, which is how you are integrating information with your previous experiences. Motor learning, which is how you're developing that over time through practice. And motor development, which is the actual change over the course of your entire life. So your motor behavior is basically describing how you move. You know, if you are used to, if you every day, you know, lay on one side, like you like prop your, you know, like watching TV like this, doing this kind of thing. If you do that every day, your motor behavior is going to more likely use your right trap muscle to contract up like this. Because it gets used to that every day, right? And so you have learned to control it that way over time. So, you know, the longer you do that, the harder it's going to be to break that. This is why, you know, I know sometimes it sounds like it's like, oh, you got to stretch this, you got to strengthen that, it'll fix your posture. That sounds easy. And it sounds like it should happen quickly. But this is a process that took years to develop poor movement patterns. It's going to take a while to fix it. You know, you might feel temporary relief. Like, you know, we made Hector do those calf stretches last night, you know, and I'll bet it helped. I guarantee you he is tight again this morning, you know, because, you know, he's been moving that way specifically. That's how everybody works, you know. So we want to use motor control, you know, to make sure that we are developing our clients. This is why you don't want to give your clients too much slack when it comes to how they are training, right? We want to make sure that we are training with good form consistently. So that motor control is going to come from all your sensory information. This is also why we like balance, right? Because it's maximal sensory information. Muscle synergies and putting all of that together. So when you're coaching your clients, I know we talked about this, if we're trying to help them with their motor behavior, we're trying to help them with their motor learning and development. We want to make sure that we are giving them not only knowledge of results, but also knowledge of performance, right? And we want to make sure that they are incorporating internal feedback as well as external feedback. So internal feedback is like all the sensory information, right? It's all about it's what they're feeling. External feedback is like a trainer saying, hey, really good job. That's knowledge of results, like you did great. And then there's knowledge of performance, which is quality, you know, information about the quality. It's like, I like how you pushed your knees out there. So when you give your clients notes like that, it's the best way to really amplify their motor learning over time, right? So don't just say, hey, good job. Say, hey, good job. I like how you, you know, kept your core tight and kept your chest up. So that's going to be all very good for external feedback. But then we also want to make sure that they get some internal feedback by saying, do you feel how that set was different from your last set? And they're like, yeah, I felt it. That's now internal feedback and external feedback. That's the most effective way to coach someone. Those are the notes that are going to help the most. that's about it, guys. I know we ran a little bit over today. I appreciate you guys hanging around. Any questions, comments, or concerns before I let you out for the weekend?
Not much. Just like, it's just simple. Well, not simple, just going over what we've learned, but just expanding upon it, giving us an even greater understanding of what we've learned. Like the whole synergist, these muscles do this, your muscles should be doing this, not this. If they're doing this, it's probably this. If they're doing that, it's this.
Yep. And that's the kind of stuff, again, it's time, practice, exposure.
Yeah. Like a lot of memorization, because it's just simple stuff like, oh, if it's doing this, it's this. But in the rare case that it does this, it's that. So
yeah,
I get it, It's just a lot of, like you said, a lot of memorization.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any questions? You guys feeling good?
Oh, good, yeah. I thought I had a overall rounded workout. This just told me that I don't.
Yeah. There's always room for improvement. But you know what? We're gonna have some really great example versions coming up in the next couple weeks.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, let's kill